Hello. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the third International Symposium on Applied Linguistics Research. It is an honor to be with you, to be invited, and congratulations on a very well-organized conference, very professionally done. It's also an honor to be speaking on a program along with many of my old colleagues and friends. I'm Nick Ellis. You can find many of my publications and presentations from my homepage here. I'm going to be speaking today about usage-based language acquisition, implicit and explicit learning and their interface. When I think about language, I take basically a Saussurean view of language. Language is thought sound, patterns of sound which correspond by convention to patterns of meaning. And when we're learning language, we learn what are the patterns of sound. We learn the important meanings and events in the world. And a lot of language learning is associative learning, learning that these particular patterns of sound correspond to these particular meanings. When I think about usage-based acquisition, we can go back to a similar sort of time, and I think it's best encapsulated by this lovely poem, lovely long poem by Walt Whitman, The Song of Myself, where he spends his time reflecting on all of the people he knows. A child being baptized, the drover, the fisherman, the young bride, the old husband and old wife. And he thinks about all of these people. And he says, and these tend inward to me, and I tend outward to them. And such as it is to be one of these, more or less I am. And of these one and all, I weave the song of myself. And I think what he's saying there is that he himself is the sum of all of the significant interactions with all of the significant people in his life. And to me, that does work for selfhood. And it works as well for the song of myself. It works for language too. As I was preparing for this meeting, I noted that, gosh, it's 2022, and that it's 30 years since I interacted with many of the significant selves in applied linguistics who have influenced my thinking. And in spring of 1992, I started my first sabbatical, and spring was North America. I went on elsewhere to many other significant scholars. Thank you to all I visited then, and all I have interacted with since. But I started in City University, New York, with Arthur Reber, the famous cognitive psychologist who has championed implicit learning and the role of the cognitive unconscious. Sometime later, I was in Los Angeles visiting with Stephen Krashen, who's important in applied linguistics for the input hypothesis, for the distinction between explicit conscious learning and implicit acquisition. In Hawaii, I visited with Mike Long, and particularly for this talk, Dick Schmidt. Dick, famous for analyzing the role of consciousness and attention and noticing in the acquisition of language. And in California, I was hosted by the wonderful Barry McLaughlin, who really started the cognitive psychological analysis of bilingualism, the role of automaticity, language acquisition and skill learning, and the role of restructuring low-level representations may get chunked or compounded into higher level representations, and it's through those higher level representations that thereafter we perceive the world. 1992, we were all younger then, but they were happy times. And those visits led over the next 2 years to the gathering of some of these ideas in a book, Implicit and Explicit Learning of Languages. It's about all of those people feature in the book. And you can see already that this is an interesting set of perspectives to try to bring together. The importance of the cognitive unconscious, the importance of unconscious acquisition versus the importance of attention, noticing, consciousness. These are apparently contradictory ideas. And it's been fun. In this book, besides thinking of the larger issues, I spent a lot of time thinking about vocabulary acquisition, the implicit ins and outs, the implicit learning in perceptual motor systems, in recognizing the forms of language, in producing the forms of language. An awful lot of that is implicit learning, I believe. But the importance too of explicit cognitive mediation for learning those cross-modal associations, thought, sound, we need explicit learning. So that was my beginnings. 8 years later, I wrote a piece, Frequency Effects in Language Processing, which is a review of 50 years of psycholinguistic research, which shows that just about every aspect of language, be it recognizing spoken word forms, recognizing written word forms, spelling, phraseology, syntax, phonology and phonotactic sequences in language, just about every aspect of language knowledge and skill that you can think about is sensitive to frequency of usage. We process the high frequency forms more fluently and more accurately than the low frequency forms. And what does that mean? Well, for me, it means Hebbian learning. It means each episode of processing affects the language learner system. Learning is usage-based. This frequency doesn't come from dictionaries or grammar books. This frequency comes from using language. And every episode of processing affects the learner's system, which means that any acquisition model which ignores usage distributions is missing something really important. And we should therefore better try to understand the problem space, the lifetime of language processing events, which are the evidence base from which we acquire language. This system comes from the conspiracy of all of these language learning events. So that really is the background to maybe where we are now, cognitive linguistics, usage-based grammar, the notion that we learn constructions. Constructions are basic symbolic units, form meaning mappings, conventionalized in the speech community, entrenched as language knowledge in the learner's mind. Usage-based acquisition, we learn constructions from engaging in communication. And our creative linguistic competence emerges from the collaboration of the memories of all of the utterances in a learner's entire history of language use, and the frequency-biased abstraction of regularities within them. These views are common shared by cognitive linguistics, functional linguistics, psycholinguistics, corpus linguistics. It makes no sense to separate grammar from lexis, form from meaning, meaning from context, structure from usage. As far as the learner, the user, the person is concerned, these are integrated aspects of our language life. And I think applied linguistics too recognizes the involvement, the symbiotic involvement of all of these aspects of our life. Let me concentrate on several aspects of language one at a time. Let me think about vocabulary and the learning of vocabulary. What is it that allows us what is it that allows us to learn that association? Well, the psychology of learning tells us that a number of factors are going to be important. Frequency, how often have I heard that? The prototypicality of the learning, how prototypical is that meaning? The contingency. Some word forms are quite distinctive. Some linguistic sounds are quite distinctive and only have one interpretation. Others have many interpretations, and the contingency of that association is determining in its learnability. How salient is the word form, the length of the word, its regularity. How important and salient and prototypical is the meaning? How imageable is that association? And there are many other factors too, redundancy, overshadowing, attention transfer. Attention and redundancy are going to be key in explicit learning of those components. And all of these factors play a role in language acquisition, in vocabulary acquisition. As we showed, as Alan Beaton and I showed back in the day, in thinking about psycholinguistic determinants of foreign language vocabulary learning, where we showed where people in a lab were learning foreign language vocabulary in German. And we looked at the success of being able to produce the German form from the English or the English form from the German. And we showed a number of different psycholinguistic factors like the length of the words in the L1 and in the L2, the part of speech, the imageability, the phonotactic regularity, the spelling regularity, a wide variety of these psycholinguistic factors. And of course, we know explicitly very little about phonotactic regularity or bigram frequencies, and yet these unconscious factors determine learnability. That was 30 years ago. That research strand is very much still active and important. And here's a lovely paper from Cynthia Berger, Scott Crossley, Stephen Skalicki, 3 years ago, looking at second language lexical decision and showing the importance both for response time and accuracy of all of those factors and more. Word frequency, contextual diversity, age of acquisition, word length, concreteness, hyponymy, how high in the meaning hierarchy the form is, whether it's basic level or more abstract or more concrete than that. So wide variety of usage factors which affect vocabulary acquisition. I think it is now uniformly agreed that we have dissociable forms of learning, that we have explicit learning systems for explicit memory based very much on attentional systems in the frontal lobes and the hippocampus, allowing us to do one-off fast mapping, learning of explicit memories, keeping them separate. Where did I park my car today? But we also have implicit learning and memory systems in the perceptual and motor cortices, the association cortices, which tune averages and do the conspiracy learning and the learning of prototypes tuned by experience. And we can think of both of these in language learning, and both play an important role in language learning. As Dick Schmidt tells us for noticing, and Arthur Reber and Steve Krashen tell us for implicit learning and acquisition. Both are involved in vocabulary acquisition. Let's think a little bit about some other types of language representation. Let's think about formulaic phrases. I've got a thing about formulaic phrases. How about you? I think many people at this conference have an interest in formulaic phrases. From corpus linguistics, and I know there are many corpus linguists here, it was John Sinclair who, one of the earliest founding corpus linguists, the COBIL project, having looked at a load of language and gathered them on a computer, as Tom Cobb perhaps was will have told us about by this time. Sinclair said, a language user has available to him or her a large number of semi-preconstructed phrases that constitute single choices, even though they might appear to be analyzable into segments. To some extent, this may reflect the recurrence of similar situations in human affairs. It may illustrate a natural tendency to economy of effort, or it may be motivated in part by the exigencies of real-time conversation. But nevertheless, we use an awful lot of memorized linguistic constructions. Sinclair told us that from corpus linguistics. Andrew Pauly and Sider told us that for applied linguistics. Generative language approaches, generative linguistics, weren't really concerned with native-like selection in second language learners or native-like fluency. And how is it that a wide variety of different grammatical forms, some are much more natural and idiomatic than others? They're all grammatical, but some are more idiomatic than others. And how is it that that native speakers know that that's the right way or the appropriate way to say these things? And I know that, as I say, many of you here are interested in that. I've been interested in that, influenced again by a wide variety of people, and looking at learner corpora and native language corpora. And over the years, I've been interested, writing papers in applied linguistics, thinking about these phrasal teddy bears, these utterances which really work, and which are good ways of getting your idea across in the high demand situation like these of stressful language production. Thought about it for applied linguistics, thought about it from cognitive science point of view, and with Rita Simpson, I have thought about these things a lot for English for academic purposes and English for special purposes, and the sort of work now that Tom Cobb or Avril Coxhead or Norbert Schmidt or is doing now using corpus linguistics, or John Swales using corpus linguistics to analyze the phraseology of particular genre. And we can identify that phraseology, and we can help language learners to talk the talk, to recognize that there are ways, well put, here, a nice turn of phrase, or nowadays, quite recently, what she said. There are ways of getting those packets of ideas across efficiently. Not all language is as frozen as that. We are grammatical beings. We do learn constructions, and constructions are not fully memorized. There are patterns of components of language which, as a whole, carry meaning. If you hear the phrase, "it mandooled across the ground," you have a pretty good idea of what mandooling is. If I ask you, what does spug mean? The garm spugged him the book. I think you've got a pretty good idea. When you're reading those sentences, each word contributes individual meaning, except mandool and spug don't, because they're nonsense words. I made them up. But nevertheless, you can get an idea of the meaning of that construction as a whole, because the larger configuration of words carries meaning. And these constructions, these verb argument constructions, mandooling being V across N, and you know that mandooling is a movement word. And you've got a pretty good idea of what mandooling is, because it's the sort of verb that goes in this V across noun phrase construction. And you know that the garm spugged him the book, that spugging is a double object ditransitive, and it involves something about transfer. And you learn that from usage. Nobody's taught you that. You've learned that from the conspiracy of all of the verb object utterances that you've experienced in your language processing history. And what affects the learnability of these constructions? There are syntactic factors, the syntactic distributional factors. There are semantic factors. What are the types of verb that appear in a ditransitive? There are frequency factors. How frequently do you experience those verbs in those meaning contexts, and the association between the two? There are contingency components. How reliable is the association between that language form and that interpretation? And particularly the type token verb frequency in language distributions is going to be key in learning those constructions. And so you can think about the learning of these constructions as statistical learning, that there are particular patterns of linguistic form with particular type token frequency distributions. Come is a very high frequency verb in verb across noun phrase. Cut rather less so, moves rather less so, thud less so indeed. And you can look at the Zipfian frequency distribution. Some verb forms are much more frequent in our experience than others, and they seed the system. And those verb forms in the corresponding semantics are central in the semantic network. And they are central in the semantic network. They are the highest frequency in the connectivity and in the network. They are the prototypical forms. And language usage gives us a leg up in making the highest frequency forms also the central meaning forms. And you can analyze out the acquisition of verb argument constructions in that way, as Uta Römer and Matt O'Donnell did in our book, 2015 perhaps, usage-based approaches to language acquisition and processing, cognitive and corpus linguistic approaches to construction grammar. And the field as a whole, the applied linguistic field as a whole, has come together to combine experimental, computational, and corpus-based approaches, looking at the patterns of usage and how they drive our often unconscious language knowledge. So we've looked at vocabulary, at formulate phrases, at construction grammar. I'm going to spend a little bit of time to consider morphosyntax. We know that second language acquirers, particularly adult second language acquirers, have particular difficulty with morphology. Dick Schmidt talked about his informant Wes. Wes, an immigrant to Hawaii from Japan. 5 years after arriving in Japan, he'd been doing a lot of language usage in Hawaii, and that had allowed him to be very fluent with high levels of strategic competence, but low levels of grammatical accuracy. Wes was an unconscious acquirer in Krashen's terms. Dick said of him, if language is seen as a medium of communication, as a tool for initiating, maintaining, and regulating relationships and carrying on the business of life, then Wes has been a successful language learner. But if language acquisition is taken to mean, as it usually is, the acquisition of grammatical structures, then the acquisition approach may be working, but very slowly. Using 90% correct in obligatory context as the criterion for acquisition, none of the grammatical morphemes counted has changed from an unacquired to acquired status over a 5-year period. I used this slide at a conference, in the 1990s probably, 2000s maybe, and Dick was in the audience, and he raised his hand and he said, 25-year period. He knows Wes, he's a friend of Wes, and in the 25 years since Wes has been in Hawaii, Wes has not acquired many of these morphological forms. So second language morphology, for example, third person singular, simple presence, he walks. Yeah. That's not easy for second language learners. Indeed, it's disappearing from world Englishes, as is third person past tense ED. So world English is learning from usage. Some of these forms, if the learning environment is predominantly second language, language is changing, and these are dropping out of the language. So why is
today
that vocabulary easy to learn, which is telling us something about present tense, presenthood, and why is difficult? Why is morphology difficult? Morphology is highly frequent. So shouldn't that be learnable, Ellis? Well, there are other usual drivers, suspects of the psychology of learning. Contingency, saliency, redundancy, and overshadowing, which lead us not to attend to these forms in language and lead to that acquisition being blocked. So I'm going to take you through some of those factors now. The first is saliency and perception. And what I want to tell you, that this story is a cognitive psychological story. This isn't a story about language acquisition devices or acquisition to UG. This is a story about learning and usage. Usage leads to shortening. Any action, if it's going to be habitual, must be effortless. It's about minimizing effort, particularly in the speaker, but minimizing effort in the speaker and the hearer. If I want to communicate an idea efficiently, then that idea has got to be realized in a short linguistic form. I need to be able to say fire and get you to take action rather than anti-disestablishmentarianism, because by then we're all burned. So the most frequent forms of a language become shorter. If you think about word length and frequency, the modal frequency word length in English is around about 4 items. In Swedish, around about 4 items. So the highest frequency items become shorter. And grammatical items, grammatical morphemes, are the highest frequency items in the language as a whole. And so they become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And over time, they can't be realized on their own. They become phonologically fused with the surrounding morphology, with the surrounding material, and they get bound to free morphemes. They in themselves cannot appear on their own. And what that means
today
is that in the speech form, as it is flitting past, morphology is not salient.
Today he walks to town.
And what does that mean for learning? Well, we know something about the psychology of learning, about associative learning. The Riscola-Wagner review of 50 years of conditioning experiments where animals are being exposed to a cue, for example, a bell in Pavlovian conditioning, and that bell signals an outcome, a meaningful outcome like food. Well, Riscola and Wagner analyzed hundreds of experiments of rats and pigeons and animals learning in classical conditioning situations, and summarized that literature in this terribly influential and current formula, which says that the amount of learning on any one trial, one pairing of the bell and the food, is a function of A, B, L minus V, where A is the saliency of the conditioning stimulus, the saliency of the cue. How loud is that bell? The saliency of the unconditioned stimulus, how important is that meal? Is it a big, luscious, succulent meal, or is it just a tiny morsel? And these are two key determinants in the amount of learning that goes on any one trial. The salience of the conditioning stimulus. But we've just worked out that processes of language change mean that grammatical particles tend to be perceptually non-salient. That's going to affect our language learning for non-salient items. But it's worse than that, because that shortening gives us homophony. Many of the most frequent used words in the language are ambiguous. Sure, they start out as lexical items and they're distinguishable and they're distinct, but as they become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, so they crash in their sound forms. And so many of the most frequently used words in the language, the grammatical forms, are ambiguous. That holds for the little words of our language, but it particularly holds for bound morphology too. And why is that important? Well, it's important because there's another classic formula which summarizes learnability. And that is thinking about the association between the cue, the bell, the sound form, and the outcome, the food, the interpretation. Learnable cues are cues where every time the cue is there, the outcome is there. And whenever the cue is not there, there is no outcome. That's a learnable cue. Anytime the cue is there, but the outcome doesn't appear, the bell rings, but no food, or the food appears, but no bell, that dissolves the relationship. It makes it difficult to learn. So learnable cues are those on this lead diagonal. And you can measure this as Stefan Gries would, or Harold Bayen would, in looking at the acquisition of language from corpora. And we know that learnable cues are those where, if you measure delta P, the association statistic, which looks at the contingency of those forms, then learnable cues are highly reliable in their interpretations, and non-learnable cues are not. And for morphological forms, they're not. Language is flitting by all of the time. And that language often has s in its sound pattern. There are some words which just end in s. But sometimes when they end in s, they signal an adjectival form. And sometimes they signal third person present verb form. And sometimes they signal noun possessive. And sometimes they signal noun plural. And you can see that this is by no means unambiguous. And that ambiguity makes it non-learnable. If you calculate delta P for at the end of words, it's very low. It's very low because it signals a lot of other things besides third person present S. And it presents itself in different sound form guises as the allomorphs z and as. These take us off the main diagonal and make morphology difficult to learn. Grammatical particles tend to be low contingency. They are not reliable cues. They're not easy to learn. Worse than that, people who've learned a language before, any language, know to look out for particular salient, reliable means of expressing, for example, temporal reference. And they look for these and they use them in their acquisition and they use them in their language processing. Today, last Christmas, and these salient adverbial cues on my birthday, particularly in here and now contexts where I might be able to communicate ideas in paralinguistic ways as well. These can block the acquisition of these less salient, less reliable forms. Whatever the L1, we know that every L1 has ways of adverbial, lexical ways of periphrastic ways of communicating these ideas. We've done a lot of work on this, Mina Cintron and I. To begin with Nuria Sagara, and most recently Mina Cintron. We've tried to do the simplest language learning experiments we could to study this factor. We would bring people into the laboratory and we would show them two-word utterances which incorporate a verb form and a lexical adverb. And the verb form carries inflectional morphology, and the lexical adverb and the verb morphology both signal the same interpretation. And we would show them utterances like this and ask them, is this referring to the future, the past, or the present? Or utterances like that, or utterances like that. And we would give them many trials of usage where always there were at least two cues for interpretation. A lexical adverb signaling temporality, and a morphological form signaling tense. And when we looked at learners exposed to those forms, what we saw is that native English speakers would concentrate on the adverb more than the verb. And native Chinese speakers, particularly so. Native Chinese doesn't use verb morphology. And so they would concentrate on the verb hardly at all. When we did these experiments with somewhat more complex verbal morphology, where we had first, second, and third person verb forms, and we looked at learners' attention to these contrasting cues, native English speakers with impoverished morphology concentrated on the adverb. Chinese natives are almost entirely on the adverb and not the verb at all. People coming from Russian, a rich inflectional language, were more inclined to pick up on the verbal morphology. Those from Spanish L1 background, rich inflections, and a cognate language with Latin were more inclined still to pick up on the verb. And so these experiments showed us long-term language transfer, long-term learned attention effects to language, and the L1 biased the acquisition of lexical and morphological cues. So generally, learners tended to attend to lexical forms more than morphological forms if they have a tradition of processing morphological forms. They're more likely to pick up on it. But otherwise, these low reliability, low contingency forms are less likely to be acquired. What can we do about it? These effects of saliency and low contingency, which means that verbal morphology is not going to be acquired. So what can we do about it? Well, Mina Cintron, in her PhD research, looked at this, and we used the paradigm I've already explained to you with the more complex verbal morphology, but we added 3 different instructional groups. An instructional group where we showed learners, before the naturalistic exposure, we showed them just one cue on its own, so there couldn't be situations of overshadowing, where we trained them up on the verbs on their own. The sort of thing which Bill Van Patten advocates in input processing. If you want a cue to be picked up on, then show it on its own and make it essential in processing for the correct language interpretation. So we would train people up on the verb form on its own. Before they were exposed to two-word phraseological utterances, or we would give people grammar instruction, the sort of thing which Steve Krashen was railing against. Get out the grammar lesson to form the present tense first person singular of verbs in Latin, add O to this to the stem. And we would give them a traditional grammar lesson. I'll show you the lesson in just a moment. Or we would, in the language exposure, highlight, make salient, make attention grabbing the morphological form. And so we had these 3 focus on form conditions. The grammar lesson looks like a traditional grammar lesson. These are the PowerPoint slides which we gave to explain how Latin communicates present tense, past tense, future tense in first person, second person, and third person forms. And we let, in the grammar lesson, in the grammar condition, learners see these grammar lessons before they were exposed to the language usage. We then expose them to the language. Let me go back, sorry. We then expose them to the language, and after the usage exposure, we looked at what they knew in future language processing tests, whether they were using the verbal cue in yellow, whether they were using the verbal cue or the adverbial cue, or both. And those in the control condition, as in the previous experiments with Nuria Sagara, naturalistic language learners were picking up on the lexical adverb and not the adverbial cue, and not the morphological form, the tense marker. But each of these focus on form conditions led to more successful acquisition of the verbal morphology. So, explicit focus on form, making learners attend to the morphology in processing, led to improved acquisition, improved attention during usage, and acquisition over time. We can say that because during the usage events, during the usage exposure, during the 36 trials of two-word utterances where there was an adverbial cue and a lexical cue, we monitored their eye movements and looked to see how much of the time are they concentrating on the verbal morphology and how much of the time were they concentrating on the lexical adverb. And those in the control condition start off looking at the verb as a whole much more because it's big and it's salient. But over time, in just 20 trials of learning, they switch to spending more time on the adverbial cue. Spend more time on the adverbial cue because it's a simple and reliable way of communicating temporality. And they don't have to get inside the verb. Whereas the people in the grammar lesson start looking at the verb because they've been told about how it works, the verbal morphology, and on each trial they concentrate on the verb and they stay concentrating on the verb. And those in the textual enhancement condition stay looking at the verb, the verbal morphology, and use it in their processing over the adverbial form. And those who are pre-trained on the verb form and already know how it works, well, they know how it works and they continue using it. And they use it in processing more than, and pay more attention to it than the adverb itself. But the results of that are that with focus on form, focus on verbal form either beforehand or making it salient in processing, or with a grammar lesson which explains how that works before they hear it in linguistic usage. All of those focus on form treatments can facilitate the acquisition of verbal morphology, which otherwise goes unattended and unlearned. So, conclusions from this part on morphology. Morphological constructions are difficult to learn because of low salience, low cue outcome contingency, because of overshadowing, redundancy, because of blocking from L1 knowledge. L2 learners know already about lexical, phrasal, and pragmatic cues to meaning. They look out for these, and these can block L2 morphological acquisition. This is particularly the case for learners whose L1 doesn't use similar morphological constructions. These factors lead to morphology not being attended in usage. This lack of attention results in lack of implicit learning. But different types of form-focused instruction, pre-training, textual enhancement, any focus on form technique, grammar instruction can focus learners' attention on morphology and usage and lead to better acquisition from usage. Form-focused instruction is recruiting learners' explicit conscious processing and allowing them to consolidate, unitize form-function bindings of novel L2 constructions that previously they had not noticed. And once a construction has been represented in that way, its subsequent use in implicit processing can update the statistical tallying of its frequency of usage and its probabilities of form-function mapping. Oh, at the end of the word can mean third person present tense S. So a long and overlong and complicated story. I've recently summarized 30 years of research on second language learning of morphology in this paper in JESLA. It's open source. You can download it off my website or off the JESLA site. At one point in that paper, I say that for language learning, we need both explicit and implicit learning. Implicit and explicit knowledge are dissociable but cooperative. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient. Without implicit learning, there's no proficiency nor integration of a construction into the language system, as Krashen would say. Without explicit noticing, there's no chance, or at least significantly reduced chance, of further implicit learning, as Dick Schmidt might say. In my papers, I've reviewed the psychological, neurobiological, linguistics, usage-based, cognitive linguistic evidence by which shows us that explicit knowledge impacts upon language learning from usage. The interface is dynamic. It happens transiently during that focus on form event, but the influence upon implicit learning and cognition endures thereafter. And there are many different people looking at language learning, and they may use different perspectives on usage and different criteria for acquisition. Interesting to see John Norris at this conference thinking about testing the results of language learning and task-based learning. So thinking about usage or practice or processing or prediction, explicit consolidation of a construction from some sort of focus on form, and its subsequent repeated usage or practice or processing or prediction or failure of prediction, particularly, resulting in better learning outcomes, be the outcome accuracy or entrenchment or automatization or fluency, or breadth or depth or richness or precision or idiomaticity, or native-like selection in collocation and phraseology, or proficiency or pragmatic competence. I think all of this research is showing us that both explicit and implicit learning are necessary in language learning from usage. In what I've talked about today, I've been focusing pretty much on regularly recurring contexts of use, individual contexts of use, the neurobiological and cognitive processes which lead to acquisition, and the sum of these leading to the conspiracy of our language knowledge over time. But I want to point out that this is just a tiny part of the story, as the Douglas Fir Group recognized in the Modern Language Journal paper 5 years ago now, the transdisciplinary framework for SLA in the multilingual world, where we thought about these episodes of language cognition, but thought about them in the broader framework of societal, sociocultural, ideological aspects of language usage, of engaging with others in multilingual contexts, acting and interacting to communicate, to engage with others, to share meanings, to cooperate. And our ways of doing that are affected by our contexts, our cultural contexts, our environmental contexts, our physical contexts, where we can make use of a wide variety of linguistic, but also prosodic, interactional, non-verbal, graphic, pictorial, artifactual, semiotic resources, where we bring with us a background of interacting with our significant others in our schools, our neighborhoods, our places of work, bringing with it our social identities, and bringing with it our long-term, but our cultural long-term belief systems, cultural values, political values, religious values, economic values. All of this is very much taking place in a context. We've started in this research program, thinking about linguistic constructions. Language form corresponding to interpretations, semantic, pragmatic discourse functions. And we've thought about the association of associative learning of those forms. These constructions as being acquired by an associative learning system. And much of the research that's gone on in the learning of these constructions nowadays takes place using some form of computational modeling which approximates neural networks and the associations between particular language inputs and the associations with particular semantic interpretations. And Dick Schmidt and I did a study on artificial language learning of plural morphology using a connectionist network. And we've really got to think about neural networks as they are exposed to these particular patterns of language in the input. We've got to think as well about the combined experience of usage. And usage is patterned in particular ways that highlight particular language forms. They're much more frequent in the input, and highlight particular interpretations. Some interpretations are much more prototypical than others. We've got to think about our embodiment and how our embodiment is our interface with the world. We interface with the world with these particular perceptual units, and we understand the world with these particular motoric, kinesthetic representations. And we attend to different aspects of the world, and it is that attention which focuses on what we're going to learn from a particular conscious experience, a percept rather than a sensation, in a social interaction, a socially interactive language learning and communicative environment, which sometimes can be supported by a particular instructional and cultural context. So it's a complex system. There's a lot going on. It's fascinating. And in 2007, I used this very slide in a AAAL symposium, multiple perspectives on interaction in second language acquisition. I and many other of us in applied linguistics had been thinking along these various lines. The Douglas Fir group summarized or overviewed a range of these perspectives. 3 years ago, I published an article in Modern Language Journal, Essentials of a Theory of Language Cognition, where I prioritize corpus computational psycholinguistic approaches, cognitive linguistic approaches, complex adaptive system and network science approaches, but very much in a post-Cartesian, in a 4E cognition, and a distributed cognition approach to language learning, emphasizing not just the 4 E's of embodied cognition, enactivism, embeddedness, the extended mind, but also more recently the role of emotion and the fact that really you've got to be there to do the associative learning of how to express emotions. And the theory of mind stuff, which is that we really need empathy, here and nowness, shared intent, cooperation and collaboration to understand and acquire language, and that our language cognition emerges from the history of our language usage. So bringing things belatedly together, language usage is highly patterned in ways that support learning. Language acquisition is guided by this patterning. Language users have rich implicit statistical knowledge of these patterns. Language processing is guided by this patterning. We learn language from usage. I keep doing that there. Usage affects the shape of language. Language change is a result of usage. It affects the shape of learners. Some things are more salient in our communication, and that affords learning. We have learned attention. We share attention with our collaborators? How do we get at the processes of language learning and acquisition? I think we need a transdisciplinary language science approach. We need to bring together cognitive linguistics and cognitive science. We need to think about the psychology of learning, psycholinguistics, applied linguistics, second language acquisition. We need to think about corpus linguistics, natural language processing, computational approaches. All of these are important in our understanding of the learning of language from our everyday cognition. For today, I've been interested particularly in the interface between explicit and implicit knowledge. I've shown you this picture several times during the course of this event. It's something which I've used a fair bit in plenaries over the last 30 years. What I want to get at is explicit and implicit learning and their interface. That'll do. Thank you. Clearly, the talk that I had prepared takes a good chunk longer than 45 minutes. And so what I'm going to do this afternoon is cut this down. But I'm also going to keep it and post it on my website so that you can come back to it if you found any of this interesting. And in the final quarter of an hour of my talk with you tomorrow, I hope to be open to and able to answer some of your questions. Thank you.